The kingdom believed the prince could never be defeated. They were wrong. It only took an overlooked Maid 11 moves to rewrite history. The silence inside the grand hall of Ashford Palace felt heavier than marble itself. Hundreds of nobles stood frozen beneath crystal chandeliers, their eyes fixed on the ebony and ivory chessboard resting between Crown Prince Adrian Ashford and a quiet Omega servant whose name hardly anyone in the room even knew. The prince's fingers hovered above his king for several long seconds before he slowly leaned back in his chair, releasing a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Then, without a single excuse or protest, Adrian looked directly into the calm gray eyes across from him and whispered, "Checkmate." No one applauded. No one even breathed. 11 moves. That was all it had taken. The greatest chess player in the kingdom, undefeated for nearly a decade, had fallen before a palace maid carrying a silver serving tray only an hour earlier. But to understand how the impossible happened, you have to return 3 months before the game that changed everything. Adrian Ashford had earned many titles during his 27 years. Crown Prince, military strategist, political prodigy. But throughout every city, village, and noble estate, people knew him by another name. The unbeatable king of chess. Since childhood, he had challenged scholars, generals, foreign ambassadors, retired champions, and celebrated masters from across the continent. Every match ended exactly the same way. Adrian won, sometimes quickly, sometimes after exhausting 6-hour marathons that left experienced players questioning every lesson they had ever learned. Eventually, challengers stopped arriving. Victory had become so ordinary that even Adrian himself seemed bored by it. During the annual Winter Founders Banquet, surrounded by ministers eager to praise him yet again, the prince stood from his seat with an expression that revealed more exhaustion than pride. His deep blue eyes swept across the crowded ballroom before he made a declaration no one would ever forget. "If anyone in this kingdom defeats me in a fair game of chess," he announced, "I will honor my word and marry that person." Laughter filled the ballroom before thunderous applause followed. Some believed it was confidence. Others called it arrogance wrapped in royal elegance. Adrian simply considered it impossible. After all, if no one alive could beat him, the promise cost him nothing. Within days, the announcement spread across every newspaper, tavern, academy, and university. Chess clubs multiplied overnight. Former champions emerged from retirement. Wealthy nobles hired private coaches. Young prodigies traveled hundreds of miles hoping to become legends. Every challenger dreamed of earning not only a royal title, but also proving the impossible could be done. Week after week, they entered the palace. Week after week, they walked out defeated. Some surrendered in 20 moves. Others lasted 40. A handful survived beyond 60 before the inevitable arrived. Adrian remained untouchable, calm, and almost disappointingly efficient. Soon the excitement began fading. Citizens stopped discussing who might finally defeat the prince and instead debated how long his winning streak would continue. Hidden beneath the palace's endless corridors, however, someone who had never entered a tournament quietly polished silver teacups before sunrise, dusted forgotten bookshelves after sunset, and occasionally paused beside an abandoned chessboard left inside the royal library. No one noticed when Ethan Brooks gently reset every piece before continuing his work. No one questioned why the shy Omega servant sometimes smiled at positions that confused experienced scholars. And no one imagined that while the kingdom searched everywhere for someone capable of defeating its greatest player, the answer had already been living inside the palace all along. Ethan Brooks had worked inside Ashford Palace for almost 4 years, yet most people could not have picked him out of a lineup of servants. That was exactly how he preferred it. Every morning before 6 o'clock, he reported to the royal library carrying a polished brass cart filled with fresh linens, dust cloths, and steaming tea for the scholars who arrived before sunrise. The library itself stretched across 3 magnificent floors, containing thousands of volumes collected over centuries by kings, queens, diplomats, explorers, and philosophers. While historians debated forgotten wars and advisors searched ancient treaties, Ethan quietly cleaned around them like another piece of furniture. Servants were expected to remain invisible, and Ethan had mastered the art perfectly. He listened far more than he spoke. Every conversation became another lesson. Every forgotten manuscript became another teacher. Once the scholars left each evening, the enormous reading hall belonged to silence. Sunlight faded through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across rows of empty tables. That was when Ethan finally allowed himself a luxury he never enjoyed during the day. Hidden in the far corner of the library stood an old chessboard carved from walnut, its pieces worn smooth by generations of royal hands. Most people believed it was merely decoration. Ethan knew better. According to palace records, every king of Ashford had once practiced there before entering official tournaments. Night after night, Ethan carefully arranged the pieces before replaying legendary matches recorded in faded journals. Sometimes he followed the moves exactly as written. Other nights, he stopped halfway through and quietly searched for better answers than the masters had found decades earlier. There was no audience to impress and no trophy waiting at the end. Solving impossible positions simply brought him peace. He had learned the game from his grandfather, a gentle man who repaired clocks in a small coastal town nearly 500 miles from the capital. Every Sunday afternoon, they would sit beside the workshop window as waves rolled against the harbor, and his grandfather would remind him of the same lesson. The strongest player is rarely the one who attacks first. The strongest player is the one who understands what the other person believes is impossible. Ethan never forgot those words, even after illness claimed his grandfather years later. They became the quiet rhythm behind every decision he made. At the palace, however, no one cared whether a servant understood chess. Nobles walked past him without making eye contact. Young aristocrats occasionally handed him empty teacups without acknowledging he existed. Visiting champions discussed brilliant strategies only a few feet away while Ethan silently refilled their coffee. Ironically, many of those celebrated players repeated ideas he had already rejected months earlier while studying alone after work. Still, he never interrupted. Recognition had never been his goal. Peace was enough. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed because of a single forgotten notebook. While organizing shelves inside the restricted archives, Ethan discovered a leather journal that had slipped behind a cabinet decades earlier. The faded cover carried the royal crest, and inside rested handwritten analyses from a king who had ruled nearly 100 years before Adrian was born. Every page challenged accepted chess principles, proposing daring sacrifices and elegant traps that modern instructors considered impossible. Ethan spent weeks carefully studying every position after finishing his duties, testing each variation until he understood not only the moves, but also the ideas hidden beneath them. Slowly, countless patterns connected inside his mind like stars forming a constellation. Then, one quiet evening, he reached the final page. Beneath the last completed game, one sentence had been written in neat black ink. The day an opponent defeats the undefeated king, victory will come long before the final move because the battle is won the moment pride mistakes certainty for truth. Ethan closed the journal, looked toward the palace towers outside the rain-covered window, and for the first time since hearing the prince's remarkable promise, he wondered whether an impossible challenge might simply be a puzzle waiting for the right solution. Ethan tried to dismiss the thought as quickly as it had appeared. He was a palace servant, not a noble scholar, certainly not someone destined to sit across from the future king. Yet the sentence from the forgotten journal refused to leave his mind. Over the following weeks, every evening became another quiet lesson. After completing his duties, he recreated each of Prince Adrian's published tournament victories from official records stored inside the royal archives. He did not admire the prince's victories the way everyone else did. Instead, he searched for moments that almost became mistakes, tiny hesitations, slightly safer choices, positions where another path might have existed. Most spectators only remembered that Adrian always won. Ethan became fascinated by the questions nobody asked. What nearly happened before victory? What possibility had everyone overlooked? The answers slowly revealed themselves. Adrian was brilliant beyond comparison, but brilliance created habits. Every champion trusted patterns that had rewarded them thousands of times before. Ethan began recognizing those patterns until they felt as familiar as the library corridors he walked every day. One evening, the palace steward noticed Ethan arranging chess pieces after closing hours. The older beta smiled kindly before shaking his head. "You enjoy that old game more than anyone I have ever met," he said. It is a shame servants are not allowed to enter the royal tournament. Ethan simply smiled in return. Watching is enough. At least, that was what he believed. Then the rules unexpectedly changed. As the final month of the competition approached, participation had fallen dramatically. Nearly every famous player in the kingdom had already accepted defeat. Newspapers stopped printing predictions because readers already knew the outcome before each match began. Hoping to restore public excitement, the Royal Council announced a surprising amendment. The final qualifying round would be open to every citizen of the kingdom regardless of title, profession, or social standing. Any adult willing to register could challenge the prince after passing a brief preliminary examination administered by the Royal Chess Academy. The announcement spread through the palace before breakfast. Servants whispered while polishing silverware. Gardeners discussed it beside the fountains. Stable workers joked that perhaps one of the horses should enter the tournament since the scholars had already failed. Ethan listened quietly while pouring tea for the librarians. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing before the registration notice posted outside the palace gates. Hundreds of signatures already covered the page. Merchants, teachers, bakers, soldiers, tailors, even fishermen from distant villages had written their names. The empty line at the bottom seemed to wait for him. His hand remained still. Every sensible reason urged him to walk away. If he lost, everyone would laugh at the servant who believed he belonged among masters. If he somehow won a preliminary match, he would become the center of attention he had spent years avoiding. Neither outcome appealed to him. You should sign it. Ethan turned and found an elderly librarian standing behind him with folded arms and an amused expression. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had worked inside the Royal Library longer than anyone could remember. She had watched Ethan carefully restore damaged manuscripts, organize forgotten collections, and quietly solve impossible cataloging problems that baffled younger scholars. I have seen the chessboard every morning, she said softly. The pieces are never where I left them the night before. Ethan lowered his eyes, embarrassed. I only practice after work. Eleanor nodded as though confirming something she had suspected for years. Then perhaps it is time the world discovered what the palace shelves have known all along. Ethan looked once more at the long list of hopeful challengers. His grandfather's words echoed gently in his memory, followed by the mysterious sentence from the forgotten royal journal. Before doubt could return, he accepted the ink pen from the registration table and carefully wrote two simple words in neat handwriting. Ethan Brooks. The moment the ink dried, he had no way of knowing that a decision lasting only a few seconds had already begun changing not only his own future, but also the destiny of the prince who believed no one could ever truly surprise him. The qualifying tournament began on a bright Saturday morning, and for the first time in years the Royal Chess Academy overflowed with excitement instead of certainty. Long lines stretched from the registration hall to the palace gardens as competitors from every corner of the kingdom waited patiently for their chance. Some wore elegant tailored suits that reflected noble wealth. Others arrived in simple work clothes, carrying lunch baskets instead of polished briefcases. The game had become the great equalizer, at least for one remarkable weekend. Ethan quietly joined the end of the line wearing the same modest servant uniform he had finished polishing only an hour earlier. More than one curious glance drifted toward him, but nobody paid much attention after noticing the embroidered palace crest on his sleeve. Most assumed he had simply delivered documents or refreshments. They never imagined he was there to compete. The preliminary examination required each participant to solve 5 increasingly difficult chess positions against academy instructors. Every successful candidate advanced to the next stage. Ethan entered his assigned room without attracting notice. An elderly examiner greeted him politely before arranging the first board. Take your time, the instructor said with a friendly smile. Many strong players become nervous during these puzzles. Ethan nodded respectfully and studied the position. Less than 30 seconds later, he announced the winning sequence. The examiner blinked, checked the solution booklet twice, then quietly reset the pieces for the second challenge. This pattern repeated until the 5th and final puzzle. By the end of the session, the instructor removed his glasses, stared at Ethan with genuine surprise, and asked, "Young man, where did you study?" Ethan answered honestly, "Mostly in the palace library." The instructor laughed softly, assuming it was a humble joke, then stamped Ethan's qualification papers with approval. Throughout the day, stronger rounds followed. Competitors who had confidently spoken about defeating the prince disappeared one after another. Ethan continued advancing without dramatic celebrations or emotional victories. He simply thanked each opponent, organized the pieces after every match, and quietly walked to the next table. His calm demeanor confused spectators far more than flashy confidence would have. By sunset, only 8 players remained. Several reporters hurried through the academy gathering stories about famous finalists. They interviewed decorated professors, celebrated tournament champions, and wealthy patrons known throughout the kingdom. Nobody stopped to question the quiet servant sitting alone beside a window reading a borrowed strategy book while waiting for the next pairing. The following morning, the quarterfinals narrowed the field to 4. Ethan defeated a retired national champion after patiently surviving a complicated endgame that lasted nearly 3 hours. Observers began whispering among themselves. Some wondered whether the palace servant had simply enjoyed extraordinary luck. Others argued that luck did not survive this many matches. When the semifinals concluded that afternoon, the impossible became official. Ethan Brooks had earned the right to face Crown Prince Adrian Ashford in the championship match. Palace messengers rushed through the capital, delivering the unexpected news. Noble families canceled dinner plans to attend the final. Merchants closed shops early. Even servants throughout Ashford Palace quietly adjusted their schedules, hoping to witness history from distant hallways. Inside his private study, Adrian received the tournament report while reviewing military correspondence. His trusted advisor placed the final results on the desk. Adrian glanced down, expecting another familiar grandmaster's name. Instead, his eyes settled on 2 simple words: Ethan Brooks. He searched his memory without success. "Who is he?" Adrian asked. The advisor hesitated before answering. "According to palace employment records, Your Highness, he serves in the royal library." Adrian raised one eyebrow with quiet curiosity rather than concern. "A library servant reached the final?" The advisor nodded. "Without losing a single match." For the first time since announcing his remarkable challenge months earlier, Adrian leaned back in thoughtful silence. Somewhere deep inside, beyond confidence and routine, a small voice whispered that perhaps tomorrow would not unfold exactly as every other tournament had before. The championship match transformed Ashford Palace into the center of the entire kingdom. Before sunrise, elegant carriages lined the royal courtyard while visitors gathered behind velvet ropes, hoping to witness an event many believed would become another routine victory for the Crown Prince. Inside the grand hall, rows of polished oak chairs stretched beneath towering stained glass windows, every seat filled with nobles, scholars, military officers, merchants, and academy instructors who had traveled hundreds of miles simply to watch history unfold. At precisely 10 o'clock, Prince Adrian Ashford entered through the eastern doors wearing a navy ceremonial suit embroidered with silver thread. The audience rose to its feet immediately. He acknowledged them with a polite nod before taking his familiar place behind the white chess pieces. Calm confidence surrounded him as naturally as sunlight. Across the room, a palace attendant quietly announced the challenger. The western doors opened, and Ethan Brooks stepped inside, carrying no symbols of status beyond the qualification certificate folded neatly inside his pocket. He wore the same simple servant uniform he had worn throughout the tournament. Conversations instantly dissolved into whispers. Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances. Others openly frowned. A few reporters hurriedly checked their notes, convinced some mistake had occurred. Ethan crossed the marble floor without rushing, his expression peaceful despite hundreds of curious eyes following every step. When he reached the table, he bowed respectfully toward the prince. Adrian returned the gesture with equal courtesy before speaking for the first time. "Congratulations on reaching the final, Mr. Brooks." Ethan smiled softly. "Thank you, Your Highness. It is an honor to share the board with you." The royal referee reviewed the tournament rules before inviting both players to inspect the pieces. Adrian noticed something unexpected. Ethan's hands showed no sign of nervousness. Most challengers revealed anxiety through restless fingers or hurried breathing long before the first move. Ethan simply adjusted one white pawn by a fraction of an inch, as though arranging books on a library shelf. The observation lingered quietly in Adrian's mind. Moments later, the chief minister stood to address the audience. He reminded everyone that months earlier the prince had publicly pledged to marry any challenger who defeated him under official tournament conditions. Laughter followed the announcement, although it sounded far less certain than it had during the original banquet. After watching Ethan eliminate every celebrated opponent, even the skeptics had begun wondering whether impossible things occasionally happened. The minister concluded by asking both participants if they accepted the terms. Adrian answered immediately. A promise has value only when it remains unbroken. Ethan nodded respectfully. I understand the responsibility of sitting at this table. The referee placed the ceremonial clock between them and announced that the championship had officially begun. Adrian opened with the exact first move he had used in dozens of famous victories. It was elegant, disciplined, and deeply familiar. Ethan responded almost instantly. Another ordinary move followed. Then another. Spectators relaxed, believing they recognized a conventional opening that had appeared in countless championship books. Adrian also felt comfortable. Everything unfolded according to expectation. Yet after only a handful of exchanges, he noticed a curious detail. Ethan was not merely reacting. Every move arrived with quiet certainty, as though the servant had already visited this position many times before. There was no hesitation, no searching, no uncertainty. Across the board sat a man who seemed less interested in defeating a prince than in completing a conversation that had somehow begun long before either of them entered the hall. Adrian leaned forward for the first time that morning, studying the arrangement more carefully than he had expected to. Somewhere beyond the orderly lines of polished pieces, he sensed that the familiar road beneath his feet was slowly leading somewhere entirely new. The opening unfolded so smoothly that many spectators began whispering among themselves, convinced they were witnessing another familiar demonstration of Prince Adrian's superiority. The first three moves reflected classical principles taught in every royal academy. By the fifth move, several respected masters sitting in the front row exchanged satisfied smiles. They recognized the position immediately. Adrian had reached this exact structure before, and every previous opponent had slowly collapsed under its hidden pressure. Ethan remained completely still. His breathing never changed. Instead of staring at the entire board, his eyes rested quietly on a single knight, as though listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Adrian noticed the unusual focus, but dismissed it. Countless challengers had attempted unconventional thinking before. None had escaped defeat. The prince confidently advanced another piece, strengthening his center while subtly inviting Ethan to make what appeared to be an obvious exchange. Around the hall, experienced players nodded with approval. It was a beautiful trap, elegant enough that many did not even recognize it as one. Ethan looked at the position for only a few seconds before gently moving his bishop to an unexpected square. A faint murmur spread across the audience. One academy professor quietly frowned. Another reached for his notebook. The move ignored conventional wisdom entirely, sacrificing short-term activity in favor of an invisible idea hidden several turns ahead. Adrian raised one eyebrow with genuine curiosity. It was not the strongest move according to accepted theory, yet somehow it made the position feel unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Adrian paused longer than his opponent. He leaned forward, studying the board from different angles. Every variation he calculated eventually returned to the same conclusion. His advantage remained intact. Even so, something refused to settle comfortably in his mind. Ethan had not played the move of someone hoping for survival. He had played the move of someone quietly building a destination. Adrian continued confidently. The sixth move arrived with practiced precision. Ethan answered immediately. Then came the seventh. Once again, Ethan responded without hesitation. Members of the Royal Chess Academy who had spent decades teaching advanced strategy slowly stopped taking notes. Instead, they watched in complete silence. The patterns unfolding before them belonged to no opening they recognized. It was as though an ancient melody had unexpectedly acquired new notes without losing its harmony. By the eighth move, Adrian finally understood what had been troubling him since the match began. Ethan was not challenging individual moves. He was quietly reshaping the entire conversation. Every choice removed one comfortable option after another without appearing aggressive. The prince still possessed excellent pieces, strong structure, and complete material equality. Yet every familiar road seemed to end one step earlier than expected. Adrian smiled almost imperceptibly. It was the first sincere smile anyone had seen from him during a tournament in years. Across the board, Ethan noticed it and politely returned the expression before lowering his eyes to the pieces once again. The audience misread the exchange as simple sportsmanship. Only the two players understood its meaning. They had both recognized that the game had already become something extraordinary. Adrian rested his fingertips lightly against the edge of the table before making his ninth move. The sound of polished wood touching marble echoed softly through the silent hall. Ethan responded almost before the echo disappeared. Several grandmasters suddenly leaned forward in disbelief. One elderly instructor quietly whispered, "That cannot be right." Another replied just as softly, "No, it is right. We simply never imagined it." Adrian stared at the new position. The confidence that had accompanied him into every championship of his adult life remained, but it was now joined by something he had almost forgotten existed. Surprise. Somewhere deep inside the elegant simplicity of Ethan Brooks's quiet strategy, the prince realized he was no longer playing the game he believed he had mastered. He was following a path his opponent had begun laying long before the first piece had ever been touched. The room had become so quiet that the steady ticking of the ceremonial chess clock sounded louder than the whispers that had filled the hall only minutes earlier. Every spectator understood they were watching something unusual, even if very few could explain exactly why. Adrian studied the board with complete concentration. For years he had relied on flawless calculation, but calculation alone no longer offered immediate answers. Ethan's position appeared remarkably ordinary. There were no spectacular sacrifices, no reckless attacks, no dramatic threats demanding instant attention. Instead, every piece occupied a square where it quietly supported another, forming a balance so natural that its strength became almost invisible. Adrian slowly reached for his queen before stopping halfway. His fingers remained suspended above the board as another possibility entered his mind. Then another. None of them felt completely right. Across the table, Ethan waited with the same calm patience he displayed while arranging books in the royal library. He never glanced toward the audience. He never searched Adrian's face for signs of doubt. His attention rested entirely on the 64 squares before him, as though nothing else in the kingdom existed. After nearly 2 full minutes, Adrian finally completed his 10th move. The sound of the polished piece touching the board echoed softly beneath the crystal chandeliers. Ethan responded almost instantly. His knight slid forward with gentle precision, occupying a square that seemed harmless at first glance. Several spectators blinked in confusion. Others leaned closer, trying to understand why such an ordinary move had suddenly caused visible concern on the prince's face. Adrian immediately began calculating. One variation led to equality. Another appeared promising until a hidden response quietly dissolved the advantage. A third line ended with uncomfortable pressure against his king despite no obvious attack being present. The more deeply he explored the position, the narrower every path became. It felt less like being trapped and more like discovering that every familiar door had somehow been replaced overnight. At the judges' table, the academy instructors silently exchanged papers covered with hurried calculations. Professor Edwin Mercer, considered one of the greatest chess historians in the kingdom, slowly removed his spectacles before whispering, "He prepared this." Another instructor frowned. Prepared what? Mercer never looked away from the board. Not the opening. The prince. Those words spread quietly among the officials. They finally understood what Ethan had accomplished. He had not memorized moves. He had studied Adrian himself. Months spent examining every recorded championship had revealed habits invisible to everyone else. Ethan had built an entire strategy around choices the prince naturally preferred, allowing Adrian's own confidence to guide him toward a position unlike anything he had ever experienced before. Adrian suddenly looked up from the board and met Ethan's eyes. There was no frustration in his expression, only honest curiosity. "You knew I would choose this variation," he said softly. Ethan answered with equal respect. "I hoped you would." A faint smile touched Adrian's face again. "You have been studying me for a long time." Ethan hesitated only briefly before replying. "I have been studying great chess for a long time. You simply happened to become part of that lesson." Several nobles expected the prince to react with wounded pride. Instead, Adrian quietly nodded, almost appreciating the answer. He lowered his eyes toward the board one final time and searched every remaining possibility. Minutes passed. The audience remained perfectly still. Finally, Adrian released a slow breath and made what he believed was the strongest move still available. Ethan thanked him with a gentle nod before calmly reaching for his final piece. Without the slightest hesitation, he completed the 11th move exactly as he had envisioned countless evenings inside the silent royal library. The moment the piece settled onto its square, Professor Mercer quietly closed his notebook. "It is over," he whispered. Around him, confused spectators searched the board, still unable to see what only the masters had finally recognized. Then Adrian looked once across the elegant arrangement of pieces, and for the first time in nearly 10 undefeated years, he understood there was only one honest word left to say. Adrian looked at the board for nearly a full minute after Ethan's final move. Every calculation returned to the same unavoidable conclusion. Every escape disappeared before it could truly begin. His king was not surrounded by overwhelming force, but by perfect understanding. The realization settled over him with remarkable clarity. He had not been outplayed by chance. He had been understood more deeply than anyone had ever understood his game before. A quiet smile slowly appeared on his face, surprising everyone in the hall. Then, with complete composure, Adrian gently rested his fingertips on the edge of the chessboard and said the single word every spectator had been waiting to hear. "Checkmate." Silence swept across the grand hall. The judges stared at one another before hurriedly reviewing the final position one last time. Their examination lasted only a few moments because there was nothing to dispute. The result was absolute. Professor Mercer rose from his seat first. "The championship is concluded," he announced with unmistakable emotion in his voice. "The victor is Ethan Brooks." The hall remained frozen for another heartbeat before astonished murmurs spread in every direction. Some nobles could not believe that a servant had defeated the greatest player the kingdom had ever known. Others simply stood speechless, unable to process how an undefeated decade had ended in only 11 moves. Reporters filled page after page of notebooks, while academy instructors eagerly copied the final position, already realizing they had witnessed a game that future generations would study for decades. Through all the excitement, Ethan remained exactly as he had been throughout the tournament. He quietly stood, bowed respectfully toward the prince, and began placing the chess pieces back into their proper arrangement. Adrian watched the simple gesture with growing admiration. "You reset the board even after winning," he observed. Ethan smiled gently without looking up. "Someone taught me that every game deserves gratitude, regardless of the result." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "Who taught you that?" Ethan carefully placed the final rook into its wooden compartment before answering. "My grandfather believed that victory should never become louder than kindness." Those words lingered in the prince's mind far longer than the match itself. Before anyone else could speak, the chief minister slowly approached the center of the hall, carrying the official tournament document. His expression reflected equal measures of astonishment and responsibility. "Your Highness," he began carefully, "the royal declaration made during the Winter Founders' Banquet was witnessed by the council, the nobility, and the citizens of Ashford. According to the laws governing public royal promises, today's result carries legal authority." Whispered conversations immediately returned throughout the audience. Everyone understood exactly what the minister meant. Adrian accepted the document without hesitation. He read only the first paragraph before closing it again. Then he stood, walked around the chess table, and stopped directly in front of Ethan. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. Ethan lowered his head respectfully, expecting formal congratulations. Instead, Adrian extended his hand with quiet dignity. "A promise means nothing if it survives only easy days," he said clearly enough for every corner of the hall to hear. "Today I was defeated fairly, and today I will honor the word I freely gave." Gasps echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Ethan looked up, genuine surprise finally breaking through his calm expression. "Your Highness," he said softly, "I entered this tournament to test a question, not to change your life." Adrian's smile carried neither embarrassment nor regret. "Perhaps," he replied, "but sometimes the most important answers arrive disguised as questions." Neither of them noticed that the royal portrait hanging behind the throne reflected both figures standing side by side beneath the morning sunlight, while every witness in the room slowly realized they had not merely watched an extraordinary chess match. They had watched the first move of an entirely different story. The weeks that followed became the most discussed chapter in the history of Ashford Kingdom. Newspapers no longer wrote about an undefeated prince or an impossible chess match. Instead, they wrote about a promise that had been honored without hesitation. Many expected endless arguments from influential nobles who believed tradition should outweigh public commitment. Yet Adrian surprised them all. During the first meeting of the Royal Council after the tournament, he calmly reminded every advisor that the strength of a future king was measured not by how often he won, but by whether his word remained trustworthy when keeping it became difficult. The discussion ended before it truly began. Ethan's life changed overnight in ways he never imagined. Servants who had once walked past him without noticing now greeted him warmly each morning. Scholars invited him to private discussions about history and strategy. The Royal Chess Academy requested permission to preserve the championship board exactly as it had appeared after the final move. Ethan accepted every kindness with the same quiet humility that had defined him before the tournament, continuing to organize books whenever he found time, insisting that understanding should never disappear simply because circumstances had changed. Adrian found himself visiting the Royal Library more frequently than ever before. At first, he claimed he wanted to examine the forgotten journals Ethan had studied. Soon those visits became conversations lasting hours. They spoke about mathematics, architecture, astronomy, literature, and the remarkable ways every discipline resembled chess when viewed through the right perspective. Adrian slowly discovered that Ethan never sought attention because curiosity had always mattered more to him than recognition. Ethan discovered that behind the prince's composed public image lived someone who genuinely loved learning far more than applause. Respect gradually became friendship, and friendship quietly grew into a partnership built on admiration rather than expectation. Several months later, the engagement ceremony took place inside the same grand hall where the championship had ended. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. There was no uncertainty, only warm celebration. Among the honored guests sat Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, smiling proudly from the front row, while Professor Mercer presented the original score sheet from the famous match inside a handcrafted walnut frame. Adrian surprised everyone with one final announcement before the ceremony concluded. Beginning the following spring, the kingdom would establish the Ashford Open Chess Festival, welcoming every citizen regardless of birth, profession, or title. Talent does not ask permission before it appears, he told the gathered crowd. Our responsibility is to recognize it when it does. The festival quickly became a cherished tradition, attracting players from across the country every year. Decades later, children still gathered inside the palace library where Ethan often taught beginners that patience was more valuable than speed and understanding was stronger than pride. Visitors always stopped before the preserved championship board displayed beneath a glass case. Many counted the 11 moves themselves, wondering how such a short game could carry such an extraordinary legacy. On quiet evenings after official duties ended, Adrian and Ethan still sat across from one another before a simple wooden chessboard beside the library window overlooking the palace gardens. They no longer played to prove anything. They played because the game had become part of the life they built together. Adrian often laughed whenever another carefully planned strategy quietly unraveled beneath Ethan's patient ideas. One autumn evening, after gently tipping over his king once again, Adrian smiled across the familiar board and said, "People still believe I lost this kingdom's most famous game in 11 moves." Ethan looked up with the same calm expression he had worn on the day they first met across the championship table. "Did you?" he asked softly. Adrian shook his head with quiet affection. "No, I only lost the match in 11 moves. My heart surrendered the moment I realized someone had seen me more clearly than I had ever seen myself." Outside, the last golden light of sunset drifted across the palace gardens, while inside the library 2 quiet players reset the board once more, ready for another game, another conversation, and another reminder that the greatest victories are never about defeating another person, but about finding someone who changes the way you see every move that comes after.